The sun had barely begun its climb over the jagged ridges of the Arizona desert when the wind carried with it a dry, restless whisper, the kind that foretold trouble. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the red earth stretched endlessly, cracked and thirsty. It was the kind of morning that made a soul feel small beneath the weight of the land and the silence of the West. But for one woman, that silence was not peace. It was dread. She pressed her hand against her swollen belly and kept walking, her worn boots scuffing the dust as a single thought burned inside her. She couldn't turn back now, not when a man's life hung between mercy and death. Her wagon had broken down 2 miles behind her. One wheel shattered from the rocky trail that cut through the canyons like a wound. The mule she'd been driving had spooked in the night and fled, leaving her with little more than a water canteen and the iron determination that had carried her this far. Her name wasn't known to many in these parts. Most folks just called her the widow. Her husband had been gone a year now, lost to a fever that swept through the valley. Since then, she'd lived alone in a small cabin by the San Pedro River, surviving on whatever she could trade or grow. But that quiet life had ended 3 nights ago when she stumbled upon the Apache boy half dead near her property, his wrists bleeding from the raw rope that bound him, his dark eyes burning with both fury and fear. She could have left him there. In fact, that's what most would have done. The settlers in these territories had learned to stay away from the Apache. Too many raids, too many graves dug in the hard ground. But something in her heart had not allowed her to walk away. Maybe it was the memory of her husband's last words, whispered in fevered gasps, "Don't let the world make you cruel." Or maybe it was the child growing inside her, whose heartbeat reminded her that mercy still had a place in this harsh land. Whatever it was, she untied the young warrior that night and nursed him back from the edge of death. Not knowing that her act of kindness would set off a chain of events she couldn't escape, by dawn, the boy had vanished, leaving only a trail of blood and broken twine behind. Then came the riders. For men, faces hidden behind bandanas, pistols gleaming in the morning sun. They rode hard, cutting across her field like wolves scenting prey. They asked questions she didn't want to answer about the Apache, about where he'd gone, and about what she'd seen. When her silence stretched too long, one of them spat in the dirt and said the Apache was a traitor to his own, that he'd sold out his people for gold and was now hunted by both sides. They warned her that harboring him would be suicide. Then they left, but not before one of them leaned close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath and muttered, "If he comes back, you best pray he finishes what we started." That night, sleep wouldn't come. The wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cracks like lost spirits. She sat by the fire, her hand resting on her belly, listening to the steady rhythm of her unborn child's heartbeat against the storm's fury. Somewhere out there, she knew the Apache was running. Maybe he was dying. Maybe he was already dead. But deep inside, she felt a pull stronger than fear, a calling to find him, to make right what the world had twisted into wrong. And so, with the first light of morning, she packed what little she could and set out toward the desert. Guided only by the faint trail of hoofprints and her own stubborn will, the land grew crueler with every mile. The sun burned mercilessly, and the wind stung her face with sand. Once, she thought she saw a buzzard circling ahead, and dread knotted her stomach. She pressed on, her mind flickering with half-remembered prayers and the echo of her husband's voice. The world around her felt like it was holding its breath. The cactus shadows stretched long across the sand, and in the distance, the cliffs rose like red sentinels keeping secrets. Hours passed. Then, just as the light began to fade into the first shades of dusk, she saw it, a figure lashed to a tree at first. She thought it might be a trick of the heat, but as she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the Apache. His bare chest was streaked with blood and dirt, his head slumped forward, arms bound tightly around the trunk of a gnarled mesquite. Arrows were driven into the ground around him like a cruel warning. The wind tugged at his long black hair, and the faint rise and fall of his chest told her he was still alive barely. For a long moment, she stood frozen, torn between terror and compassion. Helping him again would mean defying the men who'd already threatened her life. But leaving him there, that was something she couldn't live with. She dropped to her knees beside him, cutting the ropes with a trembling hand. His eyes flickered open, dark and dazed, and for a brief instant, he looked at her not with gratitude, but with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why she had come back. She whispered softly that he was safe now, that she would not leave him. But before she could finish, a low sound broke through the stillness, the distant thunder of horses. Her heart lurched. She turned toward the horizon and saw dust rising, silhouettes riding fast across the plain. They were coming. The same men, maybe more. She could almost hear their voices carried on the wind, angry and sharp, shouting over the drumbeat of hooves. Panic surged through her veins, but there was no time to think. She pulled at the Apache's arm, urging him to stand, but his strength was nearly gone. Every breath he took was ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion. She scanned the barren landscape for shelter, a ridge, a cave, anything. Then she spotted a narrow gully behind a line of rocks, hidden from the main trail. If they could reach it, maybe they'd have a chance. Supporting his weight as best she could, she half-dragged, half-guided him toward the hiding place. The sound of the riders grew louder, closer. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath as the last of the sun sank below the cliffs, painting the world in red and gold. By the time they reached the gully, the Apache had nearly collapsed. She eased him to the ground, pressing her hand over his heart. It still beat, faint but steady. She whispered for him to stay awake, to hold on. His lips parted, and in broken English, he told her they wouldn't stop until he was dead, that they wanted something he carried, something hidden in the hills. She didn't understand, but his fear was enough to tell her this was far from over. The thunder of hooves stopped suddenly above them, so close she could hear the snort of horses and the jangle of reins. Dust rained down from the edge of the ridge. One wrong move, one sound, and they'd be found. The widow pressed her back against the rock, her breath shallow, one hand clutched over her belly as if to shield the child within. The Apache's eyes met hers in the half-dark, a silent plea and a promise unspoken. Above them, a voice barked orders, rough and impatient. Boots scraped against stone. Then came the sound of a gun being cocked, sharp, final. Her pulse roared in her ears. The riders were dismounting. They were searching the rocks. She glanced down at the wounded man beside her, the one she had risked everything to save, and knew that her next choice would decide not just his fate, but her own. The desert wind fell still, and for one suspended moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then, from above the ridge, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate. Closing in on where she hid, the widow held her breath as the shadow loomed closer. The rider above was scanning the ridge, his boots grinding against the rocks. The sound was steady, careful, too practiced to belong to a fool. She could hear the faint creak of his saddle and the rattle of his spurs, each sound cutting through the silence like a blade. The Apache's breathing had gone shallow beside her. She laid a hand over his mouth, praying he'd stay quiet. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure it would give them away. The man above stopped. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then his voice broke the stillness, rough and steady, calling out to the others that there were no signs below. The widow didn't move. She listened as the horses shifted, hooves kicking at the dry earth. She heard the leader curse under his breath, then the sound of reins being pulled tight. They weren't leaving, not yet. They were waiting for something. The Apache stirred weakly beside her. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, flickered open again. He tried to speak, but she shook her head, warning him to stay silent. She could see the pain written across his face, the rope burns, the blood drying at the corners of his mouth, the exhaustion carved into every line of him. Yet beneath it all, there was a strength, a quiet fire that refused to die out. She had seen that same look once before in her husband's eyes, the night he fought to stay alive through fever and pain. As the moments stretched on, her thoughts drifted back to that life she had once known. Back before the sickness came, before loneliness turned her days into long, quiet hours filled with chores and memories. Her husband had been a kind man, a ranch hand who could mend anything with his hands and soften her worries with a smile. They had worked the land together, building a small life in the shadow of the mountains. He used to say the desert could be cruel, but it rewarded those who respected it. After his death, the land became her only companion. It taught her silence, patience, and the strength to keep moving, even when everything inside her wanted to stop. Now, looking at the wounded Apache beside her, she felt that same sense of duty to protect, to heal, to do what was right, even when it made no sense. But this was different. This time, the danger wasn't illness or grief. It was men, the kind who killed without hesitation, the kind who'd burn down a home just to prove a point. She didn't know what they wanted from him, only that they wanted him dead, and that was enough reason to keep him alive. Above the ridge, the voices grew quieter. She dared to peek over the rocks and saw the riders spreading out, scanning the horizon. One of them dismounted, squatting near a set of tracks half buried in the dust. Her stomach turned. They had found the trail. She turned back to the Apache, whispering urgently that they needed to move. He tried to rise, but his legs gave way. Without thinking, she wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled him up. Every step felt heavier than the last as they crept deeper into the gully, moving toward a cluster of boulders that offered better cover. The sun had long since dipped below the cliffs, leaving the land washed in silver light. The air was cooler now, but the night brought new dangers. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, and the smell of rain drifted faintly through the dry wind. The widow lowered the Apache to the ground again, resting his head on her shawl. He looked up at her, his lips parting to speak. This time, she let him. "They betrayed me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "My own people. I tried to make peace. They said I sold them." She frowned, trying to understand. "Peace with who?" "With your kind," he answered. "The settlers. The soldiers. I thought we could share the land." "They thought I was weak." His words came slowly, strained between shallow breaths. He told her of the treaty he'd tried to arrange, of how he'd been captured by a band of men who'd claimed they worked for justice, but were really hunting gold hidden in the Apache hills. They had used him as bait, trading his life for information he never gave. When he refused, they bound him to the tree and left him for the vultures, hoping his death would send a message. The widow listened in silence. She had heard tales of such things before, whispered stories of greed and betrayal that haunted the frontier, but hearing it from his lips made it real in a way that turned her stomach. She realized now that by saving him, she hadn't just crossed a line. She had stepped into a war she barely understood. She asked him what the men were looking for, but he only shook his head. "Something they believe I know," he said. "But I do not. The land keeps its secrets, not me." The widow tended his wounds as best she could, tearing strips from her skirt to bind the cuts on his wrists. She poured what little water she had left over his lips, watching as he drank with quiet gratitude. In the faint light, she saw the markings on his chest, lines and symbols inked into his skin, telling stories she couldn't read. Each one seemed like a piece of history carved into flesh, a reminder of who he was before the chains and the blood. When she finally leaned back, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. The night was still, except for the soft crackle of wind through dry brush. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts kept circling back to the riders. They hadn't gone far. She could feel it, like the low rumble of thunder before a storm. The Apache stirred again. "You should leave me," he murmured. "They will kill you too." She shook her head. "If they find you dead, they'll come for me anyway. I won't give them that satisfaction." His eyes lingered on her for a moment, filled with something between disbelief and respect. He didn't speak again, but the silence between them said enough. Two strangers bound by circumstance, both carrying ghosts from the past. Hours later, faint light began to creep across the desert. Not dawn, but firelight. The widow's heart skipped. She crawled up the side of the gully, peering over the rocks. In the distance, she saw the glow of a campfire. The riders had made camp nearby. They weren't leaving until they found what they came for. She returned to the Apache's side, whispering what she'd seen. He nodded, his expression grim. "They will not stop," he said quietly. "Not until I am dead or they have what they seek." She hesitated before asking, "What is it they think you have?" He looked at her then, eyes dark as night. "A map," he said. "But there is no map. Only a story my father told. They believe it leads to gold buried in the hills. I told them it was a lie, but men like that, they don't care about truth, only power." The widow's mind raced. The men weren't just killers. They were treasure hunters, driven by greed. If they found the Apache, they'd kill him, take whatever they thought he knew, and come after anyone who had helped him, which meant she and her unborn child were now caught in their path. For the rest of the night, she stayed awake, keeping watch while the Apache slept fitfully beside her. The stars hung bright and cold above, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. She thought about what would happen when the sun rose, whether she'd have the strength to keep running, whether the land would show them mercy. When the first streaks of light touched the horizon, she rose quietly and looked toward the ridge. Smoke still rose from the riders' camp, faint against the pale sky. She turned back to the Apache, who was awake now, sitting up with effort. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, without a word, she helped him to his feet. They had no plan, no direction, only the knowledge that staying meant death. As they began their slow climb out of the gully, the widow felt the baby stir inside her, a fragile reminder of life in a world that seemed set on destruction. She pressed her hand against her belly, whispering a quiet promise that she would keep them safe. The Apache, the child, and herself. But deep down, she knew the West did not care for promises. Behind them, the sound of hooves echoed faintly through the canyon again, carried by the wind like a warning. They weren't alone anymore, and this time there would be no place left to hide. The morning light was pale and thin as they made their way across the canyon floor. Every step a battle between exhaustion and fear. The widow's breath came heavy, her hand gripping the Apache's arm to keep him steady. His wounds were worse than he'd let on. Each time he stumbled, she could see the pain flash in his eyes, but he refused to stop. The wind carried the faint echo of horse hooves from behind. Distant but steady, the riders were closing in. She could feel it, the way an animal senses a coming storm. They followed a narrow stream that cut through the canyon, the water glimmering like glass in the early light. The Apache said it led to an old trading post miles away, long abandoned after a raid years back. If they could reach it, they might find shelter, maybe even a rifle or supplies. But the trail was rough, and the widow's body ached from the weight of both fear and the child within her. She tried not to think of what would happen if the riders caught them. As they walked, she asked the Apache his name. He hesitated before answering, as though the word itself carried too much history. "Taza," he said finally. His voice was quiet but strong, like the land itself. When she told him she had no name anyone used anymore, he nodded as if he understood what it meant to lose that part of oneself. In the West, people carried their pasts like shadows, always following, never fading. By midday, the sun had burned away the coolness of morning, and the canyon walls shimmered with heat. They stopped beneath a cluster of rocks to rest. Taza leaned against the stone, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The widow poured the last of the water into her hand and let him drink. She could see the gratitude in his eyes, but also something else. Guilt, maybe, for dragging her into his fight. "Why did you come back?" he asked after a long silence. She looked toward the horizon where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. "Because you were alone," she said simply. "And I know what that feels like." Taza turned his gaze downward, his expression unreadable. "In my tribe, we say a person's spirit grows when they choose mercy over survival. But mercy often costs more than death." She didn't answer, but his words lingered in her mind as they continued their slow march through the canyon. The land around them shifted, the walls growing wider, the air heavy with the scent of sage. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken things. Like two souls carrying stories neither could fully tell. As dusk approached, they found what was left of the trading post, a cluster of rotted beams, and a crumbling stone wall, half buried in sand. The widow almost wept with relief. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Inside, they found a rusted lantern, a broken chair, and a few scraps of canvas that might serve as bedding. Taza collapsed near the wall, his strength finally giving out. She knelt beside him, tending to his wounds again. The gashes on his arms had reopened during the trek, and his skin burned with fever. She tore another strip from her dress, dipping it in the cool water from a nearby pool and laying it across his forehead. While he slept, she walked outside, staring up at the darkening sky. The stars were just beginning to show, scattered like small fires across the heavens. She could hear the faint cry of coyotes in the distance, and beneath it, something softer, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and the faint flutter of the child within her. She thought of her husband again, of how he used to tell her stories by the fire, stories about men and women who found courage when the world gave them none. She wondered if she had that kind of courage now. Then, a sound broke her thoughts, a branch snapping, too sharp to be wind. She turned, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from behind the ruined post, a figure emerged, not one of the riders, but a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12, with dark hair and wary eyes. His clothes were torn, his feet bare. "Who are you?" she whispered, holding a hand protectively over her stomach. The boy raised his hand slowly. "I mean no harm. I've been hiding here since yesterday. I saw men riding through. They looked like killers." The widow's breath caught. "How many?" "4, maybe 5, he said. "They had rifles. They're searching the canyon." She glanced back toward the shack where Taza slept. "You saw them close?" The boy nodded. "They said the Apache carries something they want. One of them said if they find the woman with him, they'll make her talk." A chill ran through her veins, so they knew about her now. She thanked the boy and told him to stay hidden. When she returned inside, Taza was awake. His eyes followed her movements, sensing something was wrong. "They're near," she said softly. A boy saw them. Taza tried to sit up, his jaw tightening. "They will not stop. They want gold, not justice. They think I have what they seek. They will not believe otherwise." The widow's hands trembled as she checked the chamber of the old revolver she'd found hanging on the wall. 1 bullet left. Not much, but it was something. "Then we need to move before dawn," she said. Ta shook his head. "I cannot run again. Not yet. The fever. It weakens me." "Then I'll make them lose the trail," she said firmly. "You stay here. I'll lead them away." He looked at her, disbelief flashing across his face. "You would do that for me?" Her throat tightened. "For what's right?" Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the sand into low swirls. The night air carried a chill that cut deep into her bones. She took one last look at the trading post before slipping into the shadows, following the faint tracks that led east. She moved carefully, keeping low, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Every instinct told her she was walking straight toward danger. But she couldn't stay and wait for it to find her. The moon rose high, washing the desert in pale light. From the ridge above, she saw movement. 4 riders, dark shapes against the silver sand. She ducked behind a rock, watching as they stopped near the stream. The leader dismounted, crouching to study the footprints in the mud. The widow could hear his voice now, low and cruel. He told the others the Apache was close. One of the men laughed, saying they'd have their prize before sunrise. Her chest tightened. She couldn't let them reach Taza, without thinking. She picked up a stone and threw it toward a cluster of rocks farther down the slope. It hit with a sharp crack, echoing across the canyon. The riders turned instantly, shouting to each other. Within seconds, they were galloping in the opposite direction, following the sound. The widow slipped away from the ridge, her heart pounding. Every step taking her farther from safety, but closer to hope. Hours later, she returned to the trading post, her body shaking with exhaustion. The boy was asleep near the doorway, and Taza was sitting upright, waiting for her. His fever had broken, though he still looked pale and worn. When she told him what she'd done, he didn't speak at first. He simply nodded, his eyes heavy with something deeper than gratitude, a kind of sorrow that came from knowing others were paying the price for his choices. "They will come again," he said quietly. "And when they do, there will be no more running." The widow looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a shadow. "Then we'll be ready," she said, though she didn't know how. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of wolves. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering light on the stone walls. The boy stirred in his sleep, and the widow felt the baby move again. A small reminder of life fighting to exist in a world full of death. She wondered how much longer they could keep surviving on courage alone. Far out in the darkness, unseen by any of them, a figure stood watching from the ridge, one of the riders. His silhouette still against the stars? He lowered his rifle slowly, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the fire below. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the others. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning came gray and heavy. The desert sky thick with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The widow woke before dawn, her body aching from another sleepless night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the trading post. Taza was already awake, sharpening a knife he had fashioned from a broken piece of metal. His face was pale, but the fever had gone. The boy still slept near the doorway, curled up under a tattered blanket. For a moment, the widow just watched them both, two strangers thrown into her life by fate and danger, and wondered how much longer they could keep running before the world caught up to them. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face. The desert stretched silent before her, endless and empty, but she knew better than to trust its stillness. Danger had a way of hiding in plain sight. Her eyes caught something glinting far off across the sand, a reflection. Faint but deliberate, like sunlight bouncing off metal. She froze. There was no mistake. Someone was watching them again. She went back inside quickly and told Taza what she'd seen. He listened without surprise, his jaw tightening. "They have found us," he said quietly. "They will come by night. That is how men like them hunt." The widow's heart pounded. "Then we prepare," she said. "We're not running again." Taza nodded, though his eyes held a sadness that told her he already knew how this would end. Together they began to ready the small trading posts as best they could. Taza blocked the windows with stones and scrapwood. The widow filled every container she could find with water from the stream, just in case they had to wait out a siege. The boy helped where he could, though fear trembled in his small hands. She tried to reassure him, telling him that brave hearts beat longer than bullets. By afternoon, air had turned thick with heat. A storm was gathering far to the west, its dark clouds rolling like smoke across the horizon. The widow stood outside, watching it grow. Something about the storm felt right, the way it mirrored what was building inside her. For days she had been running on fear, but now that fear was turning into something harder, sharper. She thought of her husband again, how he once told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the faint stir of life within, and whispered a promise that she wouldn't let the child be born into a world ruled by cruelty. When night fell, the wind came first, strong, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Then came the silence, thick and watchful. The widow sat near the doorway, revolver in her lap, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Taza crouched near the back wall, knife in hand, his expression unreadable. The boy huddled behind a crate, eyes wide with fear. Hours passed, the only sound the moan of wind through the canyon. Then, from the darkness outside, came the faint whinny of a horse. The widow's hand tightened on the revolver. Taza raised his head slightly, listening. Another sound followed, the soft crunch of boots on sand. More than one pair. "They were here," a low voice called out from beyond the ruins. "We know you're in there. Hand over the Apache, and no one gets hurt." The words were calm to calm. The widow's stomach knotted. She recognized that voice, the man who'd spoken to her days before when they first rode through her land. The one who'd warned her not to interfere. Taz's eyes flicked to her. "Do not answer," he whispered. "They lie." The men outside waited. When no one replied, the leader's tone turned colder. You've got a choice, miss. Give him up, or we burn that shack to the ground." The widow's pulse roared in her ears. She looked at Taza. His face was calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the acceptance in his eyes. "If they want me," he said quietly, "I will go. They will spare you and the boy." She shook her head fiercely. "No, if you walk out there, they'll kill you and come for us next." Before he could speak again, a shot rang out. The bullet tore through the wooden wall, splintering the post beside Taz's head. The boy screamed and ducked. Another shot followed, then another. The widow fired back blindly into the darkness, the sound of her revolver echoing through the canyon. The storm broke then, thunder rolling overhead, lightning flashing against the cliffs. Rain began to fall in thin, sharp lines. Soaking the sand and turning the air electric, Tada crawled to the side of the wall and peered through a crack. He counted 3 men, maybe 4, spread across the rocks, moving slowly closer. "They are circling us," he said. "They will try to smoke us out." The widow wiped rain from her eyes. "Then we don't give them time." She turned to the boy, who was trembling near the corner. "There's a narrow trail behind the post that leads to the canyon floor," she told him. "You take it when I say. You run and don't stop, no matter what happens." Taza looked at her, realization dawning. "You mean to stay?" She met his gaze. "We end this here." Outside, the men shouted again, demanding surrender. Lightning flashed once more, revealing their silhouettes moving closer. The widow felt something fierce rise in her chest, a mixture of fear and defiance. She took her husband's words to heart once more, then raised her revolver. The next few minutes were chaos. Gunfire tore through the night, flashes of light slicing through the rain. Taza moved with surprising strength, darting between shadows, his knife flashing as he struck one of the attackers who had tried to rush the door. The widow fired again and again until the revolver clicked empty. The boy's cries echoed behind her, drowned by the roar of thunder. Then the fire came. One of the men tossed a burning torch through the window, flames spreading across the dry wood. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. The widow coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Taza grabbed a blanket, trying to smother the fire, but it was no use. The old beams caught too fast. The heat pressed down on them, unbearable. "We have to move," she shouted. Teza nodded, grabbing the boy and pushing him toward the back door. But as they moved, another figure appeared in the doorway. The leader, his gun aimed steady. Rain soaked his hat and coat, but his eyes burned cold. "End of the road," he said. "Step aside, woman." The widow stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. The revolver was empty, but she didn't lower it. "You'll have to kill me first," she said. The man sneered. "That can be arranged." Before he could fire, Taza lunged. The 2 men crashed to the ground, struggling in the mud. The gun went off, the sound deafening inside the small room. The widow felt a sting of fear shoot through her as she rushed forward, grabbing the fallen weapon. The leader struck Taza hard, trying to rise, but she didn't hesitate. She swung the revolver and struck the man across the temple, knocking him to the floor. He fell still. Taza looked at her, blood running down his arm. But there was no time to speak. The flames had spread up the walls, and the smoke was thick enough to blind them. She shouted for the boy, who was already crawling toward the back exit. Together, they stumbled out into the storm. The rain came harder now, soaking them as they ran across the sand. Behind them, the trading post burned bright against the dark sky, its glow flickering across the canyon walls. For a brief moment, the widow looked back, her chest tight with both sorrow and relief. That place had been their shelter, their last safe haven. And now, it was gone. They didn't stop until they reached a cluster of rocks at the edge of the canyon. The widow dropped to her knees, gasping for air. Taza collapsed beside her, clutching his side where blood seeped through his shirt. The boy huddled close, crying softly, through the sheets of rain. The widow could see movement near the burning ruins, shadows still alive, still searching. The riders weren't all dead. They were regrouping. And when the storm passed, they'd come again. She turned to Taza, whose face was pale and strained. "We can't stay here," she said. He nodded weakly. "There is a cave north of here," he murmured. "My people once used it as refuge. If we reach it before dawn, we can hide." The widow looked toward the distant cliffs, where lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the path ahead. The rain had washed away their tracks, but it also meant the land would be slippery and treacherous. She helped Taza to his feet, her arm around his waist. The boy followed close behind. The storm roared around them, thunder echoing like the growl of an angry god. Each step forward felt heavier, each breath harder. The widow's body trembled with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. The promise she'd made to protect her child, to stand for what was right, burned inside her like a flame that refused to die. Far behind them, the riders' voices carried faintly through the storm, calling to each other as they searched the darkness. The widow didn't look back this time. She kept her eyes on the cliffs ahead, on the faint outline of the cave hidden among the rocks. That was their only chance. But even as they climbed, a terrible certainty grew in her chest. The storm would end soon, and when it did, there would be no more hiding. The final reckoning was coming. It would find them whether they were ready or not. The morning after the storm broke quietly, with the wind drifting through the canyon like a whisper of relief. The clouds had cleared, and sunlight spilled over the jagged ridges, softening the land that had been wild with fury just hours before. The widow sat near the dying embers of the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup of black coffee she had managed to brew. The scent of smoke and sagebrush mixed with the faint sweetness of mesquite. Her eyes kept drifting toward the man lying by the tree, longer bound, but still weak from the wounds and exhaustion. The Apache warrior stirred, his breathing steady but shallow. His dark eyes opened slowly, meeting hers with quiet gratitude and disbelief. For a long moment, they said nothing. It was as if words would break the fragile calm that had settled over them. She could still see the rope burns around his wrists, the dirt caked on his skin, and the deep cut along his arm that she had wrapped with her torn shawl. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, edged with fatigue. "You'll live," she said, glancing at the crude bandages, "but you'll need to rest a while before you can travel." He didn't reply right away, only nodded slightly. "Why did you help me?" His tone was calm, but the question carried the weight of everything that had happened. The widow stared into the fire, unsure how to answer. "Because it was right," she said simply. "You were left to die out here, and I couldn't ride past." He studied her face, as if trying to read what lay behind her words. There was pain in her eyes, not just from the harshness of the desert, but from something deeper, something that clung to her like a shadow. "Most white women would not have stopped," he said quietly. She looked up at him, a faint, weary smile tugging at her lips. "I've never been like most women," he gave a short nod, almost like a silent acknowledgement of her courage. The land around them was quiet now, only the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. The silence between them was not empty, it was heavy with understanding as the day stretched on. She told him little pieces of her story, bits that came out unplanned. She spoke of her husband, who had gone out with a group of men to settle near the mining ridge and never returned. She spoke of waiting for months until someone brought word that they had been ambushed. The sheriff said it was likely Apaches. That word Apache had once filled her with fear and anger. But sitting beside the man she had just saved, that feeling no longer made sense. The warrior listened quietly. His gaze was steady, but not unkind. When she asked about him, he hesitated before speaking. His name, he said, was Tahoma. He had been taken by a group of bounty hunters after being accused of killing a rancher near the borderlands. He claimed he hadn't done it, that it was a lie told by a man who had betrayed both sides for gold. They had beaten him, tied him to the tree, and left him for the buzzards when he refused to confess. The widow felt her chest tighten. She had seen enough lies told by desperate men to believe him. They stayed hidden in the canyon for 3 days. Each sunrise brought them a little more strength. She gathered water from the creek, picked cactus fruit, and cooked what little they had. Tahoma taught her how to listen for danger, how to read the land by the way the wind bent the grass or the way the crows circled. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words carried weight. She found a strange comfort in his presence, a quiet reassurance that she hadn't felt since her husband's death. But she also knew that peace couldn't last. Word would spread of what she had done. The bounty hunters wouldn't let go of their quarry easily. Somewhere out there, men were still hunting him, man now, maybe her too. On the fourth morning, as they prepared to move, a column of dust rose in the distance. The widow froze. Tahoma spotted it too. He crouched low, his eyes narrowing. "Riders," he said, voice sharp. Her heart pounded. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. There was only one kind of man who rode with that kind of purpose in this land. She looked at Tahoma, then at her old mule tied nearby. "You can't fight them alone," she said. He met her gaze firmly. "I will not run. They will not stop until I am dead." She took a breath, then shook her head. "You won't die today." Before he could protest, she picked up her rifle and checked the rounds. It wasn't much a battered Winchester that had seen better days, but it would have to do. Tahoma's eyes flickered with something between surprise and respect. They moved up the rocky slope above the creek bed, taking cover behind a line of boulders. The riders grew closer, their voices carrying across the canyon. The widow could see their faces, now rough men, sunburned and angry, with rifles slung across their saddles. She recognized one of them. He was the same man who had come through her small settlement weeks ago, claiming to be hunting savages. His eyes had lingered too long on her, his smile too cruel. Now he was back, and he wasn't smiling. The air grew still, every sound sharpened. The widow felt her heartbeat echo in her ears. She steadied the rifle against the rock, her breath coming slow and measured. Tahoma crouched beside her, knife in hand. When the first rider dismounted to check the ground, she fired. The shot cracked through the air, startling the horses and scattering dust. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder. The others shouted and fired back, bullets hitting the rocks around them. The widow ducked, her heart racing. It wasn't long before the canyon turned into chaos echoes of gunfire. The smell of powder, the shouts of men trying to flank them. Tahoma moved like the wind, fast and sure, striking with precision. She fired again, then again, each shot shaking her shoulders. The noise, the fear, the heat, it all blurred together. When it was over, silence fell heavy and thick. The surviving riders fled, dragging one of their wounded with them. Dust trailed behind as they vanished into the open desert. The widow sat back against the rock, trembling. Tahoma was breathing hard but unhurt. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You fight like someone with nothing left to lose," he said quietly. She managed a weak smile. "Maybe that's what I am." For a moment neither spoke. Then Tahoma extended his hand to help her up. "No," he said softly. "You fight like someone who still believes in something." She looked at him, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside, her something close to hope days later. When they reached the small town near the border, they parted ways quietly. She gave him her husband's horse and enough food for the road. He offered her a necklace, a small carved charm made from bone. "For protection," he said. She took it, her fingers brushing his. When he rode away into the horizon, she stood watching until he was only a shadow against the sky. The land felt wide and silent again, but different now. She had seen the truth behind the hatred that had divided so many. The world was cruel, but it still held room for courage, compassion, and redemption. That night, she sat outside her cabin, the wind whispering through the dry grass. Her hand rested on her belly. The child would come soon, and she would tell the story Wandatha, story of the Apache warriors she saved, the men they fought, and the courage it took to stand for what was right when no one else would, in that vast, untamed land of the Wild West, where life hung by a thread and every sunrise was uncertain. One woman had found her purpose again, not through vengeance or fear, but through an act of grace that bridged to worlds that had long been at war. And though the scars of that land would never fade completely, her heart had begun to heal. The wind carried her laughter softly across the plains, blending with the endless hum of the desert, like a promise that even in the harshest wilderness, humanity could still endure.